Now move on to the Arabian checkmate. And according to Chess Kids, this is the oldest checkmate ever invented. Can you believe it? And the name actually comes from an old version of chess, which was supposedly invented somewhere in Arabia. So hence the name. And the checkmate here involves a knight and the rook. And you can only do this when your opponent's king is stuck right in the corner of the board, as black's king is here. White to play, and this is the simplest version of the checkmate, goes rook takes h7, checkmate. And you can see here the knight does a fantastic job of not just defending the rook, but also taking away the g8 square from the opponent's king. So this is the basic version of the Arabian checkmate. Let's now have a look at a couple of cases where this has actually occurred in some real games. So this is taken from a real game, a competitive game in a very important open. With the white pieces, you have a grandmaster from Armenia, and he's playing a low-rated player, but Berg here is still 2200. Now, it's white to play, and I'm really just trying to give you examples from real games where you can try to work out how to set up the pattern I first show you. So in this position, you can see that white has a knight kind of hovering around the enemy king there. And he also has the two rooks. But it kind of seems impossible to create the Arabian checkmate here because black has quite a solid position. His two pawns defend the king. And as well as the two pawns, you have the knight and the rook. So what is the key thing to do in lots of these positions? Well, if you sense you might have one of these checkmates on the horizon, and again, this is why you really should look at as many examples as you can and practice them yourself. Try to even create these checkmates yourself with your own chessboard. Set up your own checkmates. Say, I'm going to make 5 Arabian checkmates today. What a brilliant way to learn. But what you need to do is to look for the most forcing moves when it gets near to the end of the game. What are the most forcing moves? Checks. There's one check here that starts the whole combination off. So try to work out the checkmate. Pause now if you need to. Well, the way to continue here is by getting the knight to the critical square. And in the Arabian checkmate, the knight needs to be on this square here in this particular case. And you can do it any corner of the board, of course. So the knight would have to be on one of these 3 highlighted squares. So C3, F3, F6, or C6. But of course, when your knight goes to those squares, the opponent's enemy king has to be in the corner of the board, so on one of these squares. And in this position, the black king needs to be forced into H8. So we go knight to F6 check, only one possibility, king to H8. And now we need to use brute force to open it up even more. So how can we get rid of the pawns on G7 and H6? Well, rook takes H6, bang, crashing through. If the knight blocks, we do rook takes H7, and that is one form of the Arabian mate. And if pawn takes rook, which is another possibility, but it's the same result, the rook comes down to G8. And again, this is a slightly different version to the last Arabian mates because we have our rook on the back rank, not on the 7th rank. But again, it's exactly the same principle with the pattern. And this checkmate is the oldest checkmate in chess, but it's also one of the most beautiful. So let's have a look at one more case where this has occurred in a real game. I found the following example of Arabian mate, and we're going to pick it up from a middle game position just to see the whole build-up of an attack and how these combinations can lead to these patterns we're concentrating on. Well, first of all, have a look at white's pieces here. They look so scary. Every single white piece is hovering around that poor little black king on G8. They all want to have a piece of the action. You've got the 2 rooks, which have swung their way around. You have the white queen and the knight and the bishop, everything hovering around the king. Now, if you know how to set up the Arabian mate, you should work out where the knight needs to go. So where does that knight need to go? Well, that knight needs to travel into F6. So the knight here plays to H5 first, threatening to come into F6, which should win a queen. Black decides to tuck the king on H8, and the knight dives in anyway. And the knight is now on a much more aggressive and attacking square on F6. threatening a number of nasty ideas against black's king. Black has to move the queen, so the queen now decides it's safe on d8. Well, it's time to do something forcing here. You've got the knight to the best square. Everything is set against the black king. Look at black's pieces as well. Black's pieces are tucked over on the queen's side. And another thing you've got to get in the habit of doing is when you're trying to create these attacks, when you're trying to force checkmate, when you're trying to kill your opponent, don't just look at your own pieces, look at your enemy's pieces. If your enemy's pieces are on the other side of the board, not being able to defend the king, then you can smell that anticipation of an impending attack, an exploding attack about to occur, and you're going to have much more likelihood of succeeding with an attack. And that's the case here. Well, there's two ways to finish the game now. And again, do pause if you want to try to work it out for yourself. So the first way is not the move play, but it's a beautiful idea. Queen takes g6. And this is trying to force open the h-file. The point here is there's a major threat of either the queen or the bishop coming to g7. And if black takes on g6, can you see how you can force checkmate now? You need to move the bishop out the way. There's only one square. Bishop to f8 check. This is the correct square because you need to keep control of g7. And after rook h7, rook takes rook would be checkmate there. So that is the first way that white could have won. In the game, white picked a different way. And I quite like the way white did it because he was looking for checks. And checks are even more forcing the captures. So when you're trying to force the situation, you should be looking at checks first. Bishop to g7 check. The point of this is really just to get the bishop out of the way. Black has two recaptures. And I would suggest now, if you haven't seen the end of the game, work out all the way to the finish. So pause now. Well, if king takes g7, we can take on h7 with check. And if we keep checking the king, we can see that queen takes g6 will lead to mate. So black decided his best bet was rook takes g7, and now an amazing idea, an idea we've seen previously. Queen takes g6, and you're just trying to divert the rook away from defense of h7, setting up the Arabian mate. If rook takes g6, rook takes h7, again, is a demonstration of the world's oldest checkmate. So what else can be done here for black? Well, the threat, and we've always got to try to create threats when we're attacking, and we have done here. We're creating a threat of taking on h7, even with the queen or the rook. It doesn't matter. Each way leads to a version of the Arabian checkmate. So really, black has to defend h7 again. So queen to e7. But now he's left the g8 square undefended. So rook takes h7 check, clears a path, only one move, rook takes h7. Can you see the end? Queen to g8 check, and now yet another version of this Arabian checkmate. Look how many pieces white has sacrificed. It doesn't matter because he's cleared the path and created something he should be truly proud of. So a very nice checkmate. One of my favorites, the Arabian checkmate, but there's still plenty more to go. So let's move on to another one in the next video. And do remember to look at all the checkmates. Get all those patterns in your mind. Bye for now.